Recording in progress.
Hi, this is Mark Arnold with yet another Fun Ideas podcast. And today I have a very special guest. I have Charlie De Cosa. Whoa! And here he
Hey,
is.
everybody.
Hey, how are you doing today?
Hello, world. I'm doing well, Mark. How are you? Thank you so much for having me on your show.
Sure. Well, like I usually do on this podcast, I basically like the guest to introduce himself and just kind of tell me a little bit about yourself and how you got interested in music and anything else you're interested in.
Uh, well, my name is Charles De Cosa, and I've been playing music since I've been about 14 years old. Was when I started doing my first gigs. So the places that people would know me from, I was the Paul in Beatle Beat, which is a Florida-based Beatles tribute band. And it was a spin-off, one of the spin-off bands from the Epcot's British Invasion band. Um, Jimmy Pappas, who was a longtime member of the British Invasion, spun off his own group called Beatle Beat, and I started playing with them shortly after as the drummer. I started in the drum seat, and then I did the John spot a few times. I did the George spot once, and then the funny thing is I'm a bass player, so I ended up doing the Paul spot, and then after kind of immersing myself in it, eventually went from right-handed to left-handed, inspired by Artie Saraf and Jim Miller and a bunch of those guys who've done that. Um, Joe Biardi from Texas. Also, I played bass for a lot of the bands on the what they call the Sunburn circuit, the tropical rock bands. So, because I live in Florida, I ended up with a group that played a lot of Jimmy Buffett music, and that led to other musicians who played a lot of Jimmy Buffett music, and it led to me playing down in Key West a number of times, and eventually actually playing with a bunch of the guys in Jimmy's band, a bunch of the Coral Reefers, who are great guys and great musicians, and boy, had a lot of fun playing with those guys. And just around the Orlando area. So if you know me as a musician, that's what you know me from. And if you don't know me as a musician, you know me as my kid's dad because I'm at soccer constantly with them, and I've had to give up music to drive my kids around and play soccer lately. But it's wonderful. Everything's good.
Now, did you grow up in Florida or you just ended up there?
I did. I was born on Long Island, and
Oh,
I lived there till we were six. Till I was six. Not we were six. I was six, and then we moved down to Vero Beach, Florida,
okay.
and I grew up there, and that's where I met my wife, and we moved from there to Orlando to go to school, and then after we graduated college, we moved up to North Carolina for a year, and it snowed, and we moved back to Florida within a year. Yep,
Afraid of snow, eh?
that
um,
that's it. No way, not my thing.
we get a little snow here. It's kind of sporadic now in Oregon because it used to be like every year. Now it's like, I guess because of global warming or whatever, it's like every 3 years now we'll get a good snow. Otherwise, it rains a lot. You know, it's hot.
Well, it's I'm glad you got positive effects from global warming. It sounds.
It's less snowy or less cold. Um, Now, on your touring, or excuse me, on your music career, I mean, do you just play Florida, or have you played all over the place?
Well, I've played all over. I was never with a what you'd call a tour, like a bus touring group.
Yeah.
When I was 19, I got hooked up with a band called the Land Sharks, which was based out of Vero Beach, but they were a group that played everywhere. And my first gig with them when I was 19, we flew out to Paradise Island in the Bahamas, and I was a 19-year-old kid playing music in the Bahamas. It was great, um, and we played all the parks and hotels, and we traveled with that group. And then I hooked up with a group called Jim Morris and the Big Bamboo Band years later, and Jim was a singer songwriter based in Punta Gorda, Florida. A wonderful man. He was the best band leader I ever worked for. Sadly, passed away a few years ago. But with his group, we flew out all up and down the East Coast
Mhm.
playing, and even I flew out with him to California
Mhm.
and played out there. And like I said, I never did the bus touring thing. I've had a family, and
Right,
it makes it tough to do that.
right.
Um, but we used to do fly out dates every weekend. So I would go to work all week. On Friday, I would have my stuff packed, leave from work, go to the airport, fly out to New England, go play in New England for the weekend, and then fly home. And then the next weekend, I'd fly out to the Maryland area, would play over there, and it was that kind of thing.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned earlier when you're talking about all your Beatle appearances, as it were, that you play bass. So do you play anything else, or you just play bass when you're playing like John or George or something like that?
No, no, no. I play
I'm
guitar.
confused on that.
I it feels weird to say it like this, but I guess what they would call a multi instrumentalist.
Oh, okay.
When I was in school, I started out on piano. When I was in school, I played clarinet up and through 12th grade. When I got to 12th grade, I looked at the band director and I said, "Look, I'm done with clarinet." Because I wanted to play saxophone, but my dad had me play clarinet because if you can play clarinet, you can play sax, but it doesn't really, it's not as easy to go the other way.
Hmm.
So when I got to 12th grade, I said, "Look, I'm done. If I have to play clarinet, I'm done. I'm not in band anymore." And they said, "Okay, okay, we'll put you on tuba." So I went from playing clarinet to playing tuba, and then I played the double bass
Mhm.
in the symphonic band.
Mhm.
So I also play saxophone. My wife is a trumpet player, and I'm not a great trumpet player. But man, when I pick it up, I look like I'm about ready to wail really good, but then it's just terrible. So my daughter plays French horn, so I've been picking up French horn here and there, and it, there's a lot of instruments around the house. So no, when I did John, I was playing guitar.
Oh,
When I
okay.
did George, I was playing lead guitar. When I
Oh,
played
okay.
Paul, I did bass, right-handed, and then flip
Okay.
flop to left-handed, and
Okay.
yeah, yeah, some
So,
piano.
what do you consider yourself most proficient at of
I'm
instruments?
a bass.
Bass?
I'm a bass. I always say I'm a bass player by trade.
Ah, got it.
When
Okay.
I get hired on guitar for gigs too.
Mhm.
I'm a competent guitar player.
Mhm.
I'm not flashy. I'm not going to leave anybody's jaw dropping, but I can play the parts very well, and I'm clever enough to get away with it. And I play. My nephew, who's actually a really good guitar player, says I play guitar like a keyboard player. I play inversions and I play different than a guitar player would play guitar. I
Mhm.
guess maybe because I see it as a mathematical
Mhm.
thing. I guess I don't know.
Well, do you
I
play
don't
more
know.
chords, or, I mean,
Yeah.
obviously you're not doing a flamenco text.
Well, you know, a, a, a guitar player might play their chords like like that, but I don't do a lot of movement. I try not to move a
Okay.
lot. All of my inversions are kind of around the same area.
Okay.
So
Is
it's
that because you're proficient on the bass, or it has nothing to do with it?
um it's because when I look at the fretboard of the guitar,
Yeah.
I look for those patterns.
Hmm.
And I know chords and the notes pretty decent. So when I look at a chord, a guitar player might play the chord here and then move up here to play the next chord. But I look and go, okay, well, the notes for this chord are down here, but you just have to move your fingers a little different. And you don't have to move around.
Mhm.
So it's laziness is what it is. At the end of the day, I try to think about, well, if I don't have to move my hand all the way up here, if I could just keep it here and move these little fingers a few times, then I can play all the right chords in different,
Right.
what they call inversions.
But you could do it if you had to, right? If
Oh,
you
yeah,
really
yeah,
want to be
yeah, yeah. No, no, no,
flashy.
no,
Okay.
no.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now,
It's,
I'm
it's
pretty.
just, it's a little deeper, and I try to, I try to be clever about it, and it gives different sounds when you play it in different ways. I guess that's why I sound maybe a little bit different than some other guitar players. But yeah, I mean, I could just strum all the bar chords and stuff.
Right.
And I do on some songs. It just,
Now, how does the bass differ? I mean, I know, but I mean, I see some people like say John Entwistle or even McCartney, and they get pretty flashy on the bass, so they're almost like playing lead on a bass. So, arguably, what is the best way to play a bass? Is it chords or fill in, or what are you
Well,
trying to do with a bass? That's the
it's
proper way, not the McCartney way, or the Entwistle way, or anybody else.
well, it depends on what you're going for. It's so funny that you mentioned Entwistle and McCartney because that was kind of my inner struggle as a kid. When got into John Entwistle, I was really going that route. And Entwistle was a French horn player as well. He was a
Yeah.
brass player,
Mm-hmm.
and ended up playing. Normally, guys like James Jamerson played with one finger when he played on
Right.
his, what you'd call your picking hand. Most bass players play with two fingers. Can you hear that?
Yeah.
So Entwistle used three, so he did a lot of triplets.
Yeah.
So he did three,
Lots of finger moving.
and
Yeah.
and he was more of bass guitar player. His sound was bass guitar, and what does that mean? So I like to sound like an upright bass player.
Okay.
I want to sound like the guy, in the jazz club playing like that. Entwistle didn't. He had like distortion and flange on his sound, and he played very bright.
Mhm.
So it sounds like a guitar, but just lower.
Yeah.
But you don't. I mean, you can play chords. Bass players can play, and McCartney used to do a lot of fifths, what
Yeah.
they call fifths. So, you know, he'd play chords on songs that you wouldn't expect, like "If I Fell," and on the bridge for "I Want to Hold Your Hand," he plays open fifths. Um, but McCartney had more of that upright bass player kind of. He walked the bass a lot.
Yeah.
McCartney did, so
Yeah.
he got a little bit more of that double bass sound. I mean, he was using the violin bass, which is kind of shaped like that, and it had the
Right.
hollow sound to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It just seemed like later on he got more like, if you listen to the isolated track of something, it's very melodic. It's almost like its own tune, in a certain respect.
Once he heard Pet Sounds,
Yeah.
and I mean, he was already starting to experiment anyway, but once he heard Pet Sounds, he started seeing what the bass could do other than just playing the root note of the chord.
Mhm.
And oh man, some of the stuff, the bass line on Lovely Rita is just pure magic.
Right.
And I think one of my favorites from him is Another Day,
Hmm.
which was solo. But if you listen to just what the bass is doing on that, the way he skips around and plays so light and walks the bass, it's really good stuff. It really makes you realize McCartney was just a really good bass player. He understood music,
Yeah.
and he understood how to make the bass fit the song. What I didn't realize until years later was McCartney would record all the instruments, and he'd record the bass last. And what that allowed him to do was, instead of the bass having to anchor the song, which a lot of songs, the bass is kind of the anchor to what's going on. So you can't really play fanciful and light. You got to hold everything down. He recorded everything else first and then would play the bass on top of it. And it became the melodic instrument.
Okay. Did he do that just to kind of give Ringo the soul beat or whatever, or was that
Well,
just what he wanted more to do?
I think he was just being creative.
Okay.
He was the bass player, so it allowed him to be creative on his instrument on songs that he wrote, rather than just have to play boom 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 boom, which he did in a lot of the early songs.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned Pet Sounds. I know Brian Wilson played bass, but did he play bass throughout that album? I don't always look at instrumentation. I'm not knowledgeable
most
about that as much as you.
most of Pet Sounds was the Wrecking Crew.
I figured, yeah. So
Yeah.
that's what I was asking.
So it wasn't. It wasn't. I don't even know if Brian did play bass on it. Somebody's gonna. I'm sure somebody will listen to this and correct me on that. I'm
Yeah.
not even sure that he did play bass. He might have just been producing more and kind of directing the other musicians on what to play, while the rest of the Beach Boys were in the sound room complaining that they weren't actually playing on their own album. Sorry, guys.
Yeah, that's one thing I don't know either. I did a recent episode with Dan Costone, which you know from Classic Show too,
Yeah.
and we did a Beach Boys episode a couple shows back or so. And I didn't ask him anything about that, but I am curious about that. You may know this or may not, but I mean, when Brian was composing a lot of those songs, did he do demos where he was playing and to show everyone, or did he just tell everyone in the Wrecking Crew what he wanted?
I think he wrote out the music for them.
Okay.
Brian was heavily influenced by the Four Freshmen,
Right.
which was a vocal group from, well before. And when you hear the early stuff and the harmonies, when you listen to Four Freshmen recordings, you go, holy mackerel, it sounds just like the Beach Boys.
Right.
And then you realize that that's what Brian took it from. But Brian was a well-accomplished musician and arranger.
Mm-hmm.
So I think some of the stuff he did in the studio was experimental, but I think a lot of it was written out. He probably gave those guys charts to follow,
Yeah.
and he would give them the chord chart and then give them an idea of what he wanted, and then they would. I mean, it's the Wrecking Crew. Those guys played
Right.
on everything.
Yeah, and I watched the documentary, but even then, unless I've forgotten what they said, it seemed like they didn't have that much direction per se. I mean, they did, but not in the way that I would think Brian Wilson would direct them. If it was something else, like say Mamas and the Papas or Sonny and Cher, they probably just said play. It's like here's the song,
Right.
do it.
I'm sure Brian had things that he wanted to hear. I think what was it? Good Vibrations was recorded in like three or five different studios or something. And they
Right.
had to put it all together. I'm sure that they would do a take and he would stop them and he would direct them as to what he wanted different,
Yeah.
and then they might do the take again. But those the guys in the wrecking guys and ladies in the Wrecking
Yeah.
Crew were very, very sharp. So no doubt that they probably gave him what he wanted in not too many takes.
Yeah, speaking of ladies, wasn't it? What was her name? I don't remember her name, but wasn't she the bassist?
Carol Kaye,
Kara Kaye. Yeah, I knew it was Kaye something.
she was one of them.
Yeah.
She was one of the bass players, and the other one's name eludes me. She's also a fantastic guitar player.
Right.
And she did a lot of the sessions on guitar, or sometimes I think they would do two basses and two different types of basses. I think sometimes they did electric bass and double bass together to get certain sounds. It was really they had a lot of musicians and a lot of them playing kind of sometimes the same parts just to give it that stacked sound.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, switching back to you, when you learned bass and guitar and everything like that, you talked about learning clarinet and possibly sax and tuba and French horn and all that stuff in band. Did you learn everything else on your own, or did you take lessons or combination?
I took piano lessons for a short time, but the piano teachers wanted to go by the book, and God bless them, you should. Maybe I'd be a better musician had I paid more attention. But there were two things that got to me. I wanted to learn chords and comping, and I knew at an early age that's what comping is, how you play behind a singer or an instrumentalist playing a lead, and how you play chords behind them to accompany them. I wanted to learn that, and I would sit and I'd learned all my major chords, and then I learned all my minor chords, and I learned my inversions on my own, just on my own. But then I would go to, I'd have to go play, and all of this stuff in piano lesson.
Right.
So that lasted only a very short amount of time, and I didn't care for it anymore, so I stopped, which broke my father's heart. Hi, Dad. I love you. He'll check this out. So that was it for lessons, really. I try to let philosophies guide the way I do things.
Mm.
So my philosophy about music is once you learn the 12 notes and the chords,
Mhm.
every instrument is just where do I put my fingers or where do I blow into, you know? But the music doesn't change.
Mhm.
If I play the guitar or I play a bass or I play a piano, it's still going to be C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C.
Yeah.
You know, it's just okay. Now I put my finger here instead of here,
Yeah.
or now I buzz my lips, or now I blow and let the reed vibrate. I mean, there's just those things are just subtleties,
Yeah.
but the music is the same. So once
Yeah.
I guess it's like languages. Once I learned my first two, you know, after that, every time I picked up something new, it was just okay. You know, how do I do this one now?
Hmm. Interesting. Yeah, I always ask people that because I did what your dad wanted you to do. Is I took piano for 10 years. Now, the upshot of that is I can only read music. I can't improvise. And I can't play with anybody else. It's called comping. I can't. I don't know how to do that. And I remember in high school, there's a couple pianists that could do that, and I would talk to them. It's like, how do you do that? And they didn't have any answers. It wasn't until years later I was at a friend's house for like Thanksgiving or something, and this guy was playing the guitar or something, and then somebody handed him a mandolin, and he goes, I've never played one before. And he just starts playing it. And I go, how do you do that? You know? And he goes,
Yeah.
did you learn to read music or did you do it by ear? Did you do it by sight or by ear? And I said by sight. And I go, that's what you have to unlearn everything you've learned. Oh, great. The only thing good about me learning 10 years of piano is I do know how to compose music. So I could write you a composition and say, here, this will be a successful song. Play it if you can read music yourself. Or I know everything about music history and theory and everything like that. So that's what I did get out of it. But yeah, I can't play the piano really for improvising very well. Like, yeah. So,
I still want to go back and take theory at
yeah,
the local college. It's so fascinating.
yeah,
Once you start getting into it and the Bach 4 part stuff, and I remember I started out as a music major in college, and then switched over to computer science. But
no,
I remember being in theory class, and the guys who were music majors all like dreading it. And I'm like, I was so nerdy about it. I'm like, this is awesome. How could you not like this? This is what you know, this is everything.
yeah,
You're learning about how it all works, how it all goes together. But you know, if you start to take jazz theory, then
mhm,
you kind of you learn um you start to learn some of the things, some of the ingredients you need to do that comping that I was talking about.
yeah,
You know, and but even the old church music was written basically like a lead sheet, like a jazz lead sheet. You
mhm,
know, and you had the melody and it had the chords and the you know, what was it, 3/3, 5, 3/5, whatever. And then, you know, you'd play the different inversions based on what was written. I mean, it's really that's really comping. That's the earliest part of it, you know.
yeah,
It's cool stuff. I love it. I
yeah.
love it.
Well, I mean, that was the reason why. I mean, looking back on it, I used to think, why did I spend 10 years? Because even at the ability of reading music and performing in recitals and things like that, I still was pretty mechanical in my own. Uh, still, some note came up. I'm sorry. I'll keep going.
Oh, no problem.
Still mechanical in the way I was performing, and at least in my own impression, other people said you were great. You know, it's like okay, you know, it's like, but I guess everybody's more hypercritical about their own performing. Probably you're still that way to this day. Oh, I should have played like this, and I played like this, or whatever.
Yeah, yeah, and I, I have to say that when I started doing the Beatles shows, it got even more like that.
Hmm.
I had gotten I had gotten away from that because I had gotten comfortable with the way I wanted to approach the bass. I had a different when I was in my element. I had a different approach to bass than most people do. I was a gigantic, and still I'm a gigantic student of Joey Spampanato from NRBQ.
Mhm.
And if you don't know who that is, if you've ever seen Hail Hail Rock and Roll, the movie about Chuck Berry, he
Mhm.
was the bass player in that.
Mhm.
And he plays with a palm muting technique, and he walks the bass. And it's for me, like I listen to a lot of bass players, and you can see what they're doing, or you can hear, you know, the type of technique. But he plays like a bebop bass player. He
Mhm.
plays rock and roll like a bebop bass player. And if you listen to the early like Chuck Berry recordings, it's all double bass, and a lot of it is walking. And it
Mhm.
was oh gosh, it was one of the old blues guys, and you would know. I forget. It'll come to me. Because I didn't know he was a bass player. I always thought of him as a blues guitar player, but he played bass on all of Chuck's early stuff. It'll come to me. Anyway, um, so I had developed this sound, and the cool thing, and I'm not too Mark, I'm not tooting my own horn here. Everybody has their thing. I had a different sound than most bass players, and there were a few times where, like, I was on stage playing on a big stage, and then the group I was with would get done. I'd put my bass down and walk off stage, and I'd hear the next bass player coming up near the band and warming up, and I heard my sound. And I said, somebody's trying to cop what I do. And when I looked, that's what they were doing. They were palm muting, and they were playing with their thumb, and they were trying to sound like an upright bass.
Wow.
Like, but I knew that before they weren't playing like that. Most bass players play with their fingers,
Mhm.
or with a pick or something.
Right.
And one guy, in fact, after the show, when we were doing the hang after the show, he came up to me and he's like, I got to tell you, I was walking around the corner and I heard this bass player playing upright bass on stage, and I walk and you're playing a Dan electro bass. He's like, I love it. I love it. It was just really neat. What was the question?
No, we're talking about bass again. Actually, the
Yeah.
one bassist that really I was impressed with that I saw live was Jack Bruce. And the main reason is he had no frets on his bass. And it was a really, I don't know what length basses are supposed to be, but it seemed like his was like 30 feet long or something. And he could stretch all the way out there, and he played it effortlessly. He was just all,
Yeah, it becomes. Are you a typist?
yes,
Do you look at your fingers when you type?
yeah,
Same principle. Once
yeah,
you play a fretless bass, and you get used to the positions, and you
yeah.
know the positions already, but your ear starts to hear where your hand should be, and after a while it just becomes muscle memory. Your
Hmm.
hands know where to go, you don't think about it.
Right.
In fact, if you're most performers, and if they're being honest while you're playing, you're thinking about, geez, when I get home I got to take the garbage out tonight.